Good afternoon.
Hi, Lopa. Can you just try speaking again so we can make sure we can hear you?
Hi, good afternoon.
Right.
Am I
Great.
audible?
Yes, we can hear you. And just to make sure.
Good afternoon.
Oh, good. We hear you too. Great.
But we don't see you. Zubair bhai, it would be good if you can turn on the video as well in the room.
Is it okay now? No, probably it's disturbing somehow.
I guess we can start and
Okay, we can start. Probably the camera is disturbing.
okay, no worries. So thank you for returning to our second session today. And today we cover managing risk and setting targets. I hope you received the presentations from yesterday's training program, and I hope also you were able to complete the feedback form, and that's very important for you to get your certificate. So without further ado, I would request Tiffany to start the training for today. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Lopa. And just to reiterate, thanks so much for joining us today again. And a particular thank you to our host. So thanks, Lopa, and your team and all of the IFC Integrated ESG division, and as well, of course, to the Central Bank for hosting us today. It's been a pleasure to get to know you all virtually. As with yesterday, we have a number of experts here with you today, so we're happy to answer your questions if any pop up. Again, it's myself and Vanina from the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative, and we're joined also from the United Nations Environment Program's Finance Initiative with Zhongyi and Drew, who were also with us yesterday, and both of them are from the TCFD for Banks team at UNFFI. So we look forward to conducting, again, an interactive session today. I know it's a bit unique that you're all in one room, and so you can't use all the Zoom functions that we have set up, but we hope to be as interactive as possible. So when we do have a poll, please, since we can't see you, if someone can just unmute and let us know what is the consensus in the room, what are people saying. And then we also will have another exercise using Menti. So at that point, if you can use your phone to access the Menti and share your vote on the questions, that will help us to be more interactive. And we should have time for about 10 minutes at the end for questions. So if any questions popped up yesterday, or if you still have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask us those questions. Great, so let's look a bit at what we're going to cover today. So today's agenda really starts with an overview from yesterday. So we're going to just remind everyone what is the TCFD and what are the core pillars of the TCFD and why does it exist? How can you use it? And then we're going to dig into those 4 core pillars. So yesterday we were looking at governance and strategy, and today we're going to look at, as Lopa mentioned, risk management and metrics and targets. We'll do both of those 2 pillars before the break. And then we're going to deep dive into a good portion of that metrics and targets pillar, which is really understanding what are net zero targets, why they're important, how to set them. And we'll do an exercise on transition plans. So if you're going to set a target for net zero, of course, you need to set a plan as well of how you're going to achieve that. And that's where transition plans can be particularly helpful. And as with last time, we're also going to have a moment for questions at the end. If you're comfortable asking them, please feel free to ask us in the Q&A. However, if you'd rather send us an email afterwards, that's also okay, whatever you're most comfortable with. Great, so let's cover also our learning objectives for today. So our first learning objective today is for you to be able to identify the practices that you can use to manage climate-related financial risks and opportunities that are facing the banking sector. And remember from last time, we covered 2 different types of risks. There were physical risks, which can be both acute and chronic. And then we also had transition risks that we were discussing yesterday, which were categorized as well as policy or legal risks, as technology risks, as market risks, and also as reputational risks. So today we're going to look at how do you manage those risks that have been identified. Our second learning objective is to understand what measurements are appropriate and effective in measuring and setting targets for climate resilience. And a reminder, that word resilience we talked about a lot yesterday, but really that's the objective of the TCFD, is to make more resilient organizations and more resilient financial systems. The third objective today is to understand how a transition plan and how net zero targets can be implemented. And the fourth objective is to identify how the TCFD's recommendations can be used with other key tools and frameworks to create resilient and agile strategies. So with that, let's do just a bit of a review of yesterday. It was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the TCFD, and we provided a bit of background of where the TCFD came from and really set the scene as to why it is needed. And then we dove straight into those first two pillars, governance and strategy. However, in case anybody missed yesterday, or just for a refresher, let's go over it briefly to solidify those core concepts. So as a reminder, there are 4 core pillars to the TCFD's recommended disclosures. And remember that we have 11 core recommendations. So we have 2 recommended disclosures for governance, and then we have 3 recommended disclosures for risk management, strategy, and metrics and targets. It's also important to remember that while these 4 core pillars are often presented separately, as you see them now in 4 kind of pillars, as we discussed in the first part of this training yesterday, the TCFD really recommends that they're all kind of interlinked and connected. So rather think of them in that circle diagram where we had 3 circles or 4 circles building on top of each other. And the caveat of this alignment really is that financial impact. So there are certain disclosures that the TCFD does consider financially material, or to have that financial impact on all companies. And those are the 2 disclosures within the governance pillar, which we discussed yesterday. Those 2 disclosures was governance A was looking at the board, and then governance B was looking at the management. And then the 3 disclosures within risk management pillar, which we'll discuss today. And also the second disclosure in metrics and targets, which is on GHG emissions, and we'll discuss that today. Those are all considered material or have a financial impact for all organizations. So then the strategy and the rest of the metrics and targets pillar have what we describe as a materiality lens applied to them. So you only should be disclosing that information in those pillars that does have a financial impact, and it's up to your organization to identify whether there's a financial impact or not there. So one example I like to give with that is if you're deciding to disclose, for example, some work you're doing for planting trees in order to contribute to a net zero scenario or lowering emissions, you can see that in 2 different ways. Planting of trees could be a philanthropic project that your organization contributes to, and it doesn't have any significant financial impact. There might be a small cost associated to that, but not a large enough cost that it would change an investor's decision-making process. And in that case, that doesn't have to be in your financial filings. It doesn't have to be included in your annual report, but rather you might want to put that in a sustainability report. However, if you are planting trees as part of an offset, that's part of your net zero target, which is strategic to your organization in order to reduce the overall emissions, because you might foresee regulation coming forward or a cost related to carbon, then you will want to include this in your financial report because it has an impact on the decision-making process from investors. So just a quick summary on this slide. Governance and risk management are more the processes kind of behind the scene, how you make sure that what you're prepared for and that you're resilient, and the absence or presence of these processes will, of course, have a financial impact on any organization, as it determines how resilient and prepared your organization is for climate-related risks and opportunities. So governance and risk management processes should be disclosed by all organizations. Then strategy and metrics and targets are really how you're acting strategically and measuring this moving forward, so that report readers can understand the actions you're taking to measure, mitigate, and or adapt. And those should have a materiality lens applied to them. So you should determine what information is material and should appear in your financial reporting, and what information is not financially material or would not change an investor's decision-making process, and that can appear in a sustainability report. So with that, let's do a quick quiz. Now let's see how this works. In the room, maybe discuss amongst yourself what elements of climate scenarios are relevant when you're exploring a transition risk. So remember that transition risks were considered either a policy or legal risk, a technology risk, a market risk, or reputational risk. And they're the risk associated with a transition towards a low carbon economy. So if you're going to do a scenario analysis, which we discussed yesterday, and you're going to look at transition risks and look at how your organization is going to react and thrive or survive in those new conditions, which of these would you take into consideration? And so I'll give you just
risk, carbon prices, and sectoral emissions.
Great. So indeed, those are both correct. So well done. So the third one then, sea level rise, would be, of course, a physical risk. So we wouldn't be considering that when exploring transition risks. However, the fourth one would also be correct. So if you're doing a transition risk scenario, you would also want to look at economic indicators that will be changing as we shift to a low carbon economy. So great job. Thanks for that. Okay, so another reminder from yesterday is where this information should be disclosed. So the task force recommends that preparers of climate-related financial disclosures should provide these disclosures in their mainstream or public annual financial filings. So this is because in most G20 jurisdictions, companies with public debt or equity do have a legal obligation to disclose any material information in their financial filings. And as we were just discussing, the TCFD recommendations pertain to financially material information. So remember that the TCFD is a tool that can be used to help organizations to integrate this information into their annual financial filings. However, the concern that we often see with training participants is that the recommendations do not prescribe exactly where to report or how to report this information. That's because you should pull into your mainstream report in this information in a way that makes most sense in that report. This will depend on the type of information that's being disclosed, as well as your national disclosure requirements. And this is how countries have managed to make it mandatory in different countries, because it aligns well with various different regulation. Another important part to note here from yesterday's session is that if you're already using another framework, you can use it together with TCFD. So for example, if you're already disclosing with the CDP questionnaire, or if you're using GRI disclosure, you can already pull information from that and just make sure that you're having all the information TCFD recommends in your current disclosure practices. The key thing to keep in mind here is that it all comes down to financial impact. So whatever has a financial impact on your organization should be disclosed as a material risk or opportunity in your annual financial filings. And this is why we often advise that companies first map their existing disclosures, whether that be using GRI or the CDP questionnaire or other reporting frameworks used for non-financial information. And all of these frameworks have actually already been mapped to the TCFD, so you can use that mapping to identify the information also required for TCFD alignment. And then you can pull into your mainstream report anything that's deemed to be financially material. And when you're doing that materiality assessment, what you're doing is trying to understand where does it hit your company on the balance sheet and your portfolio mix. With, for example, any write-offs you're expecting, increased costs with increased revenues or decreased revenues, etc. And as you move forward in your journey of disclosure, you'll be able to move from more qualitative description to how it's going to financially impact your company to more of a quantitative analysis as you build that capacity internally. So let's remind ourselves really how that financial impact appears. So this image is straight out of the TCFD, where they summarize how these risks and opportunities hit the company's financial statements and relate to financial reporting. So when doing that materiality assessment, this can help to understand that those risks or those opportunities both flow into our strategic planning and our risk management, which then flows into our financial impacts. And when we say financial impacts, we will see it in the income statement, the cash flow statement, the balance sheet, etc. So understanding how these risks and opportunities really flow down into the financial performance of a company. But also we need to make sure that we understand that it's not just, of course, the financial performance, but also the portfolios, the makeup of your loans as well. So as we can see here, the financial impact will often be explained through how the risks or opportunities then impact revenues, expenditures, assets, liabilities, capital, and financing. Another tool that I wanted to highlight as we get started today, and that might be useful as you start advising your own market on how to disclose this information, is something called a TCFD mapping table. So we're seeing this being used more and more. Many reporters are using such a table. And this example is just from ABN AMRO, but we have a plethora of examples where companies are providing a table where they on one side put the TCFD's recommended disclosures. And here you can see the core 11 recommended disclosures. And then we see next to them is kind of where that information appears in your reporting practices. This can be particularly helpful because, as I was mentioning, the TCFD does not inform where this information should appear. So investors might have to look through the report to find this information. So if they're looking specifically for one of these pillars or one of these disclosures, it can be helpful to provide a table to show where you can find this information. However, it's also very useful for an organization to do kind of a bit of a mapping exercise themselves and understand what information might be missing from their disclosure. So for example, if you're looking at strategy A, which is identifying the risks and opportunities that have a financial impact on your organization, and you actually don't have a page number, it's not somewhere in your reporting, then that's really important for your organization to go, okay, well, we need to disclose this information. Have we identified these risks? And if not, let's start to create a roadmap to be able to identify what are these risks and opportunities that have a financial impact on our organization. As you start with this, you might want to make use also of the SSE model guidance on climate disclosure. In Annex 1 of that guidance, we have a checklist that you can use as you get started to really identify where all this information is already in your disclosure and what might be missing. Great. And Benita just shared that in the chat box, but we can also, of course, send it to you if you need. So with that, let's look at how you really get started. And we wanted to just share a few key tips as you're getting started on this journey. So the first tip that we have for you is to figure out where you are now. So as I was just mentioning, using that TCFD checklist in Annex 1 of the model guidance, or creating a mapping table yourself, it's important to start your journey with understanding where you are now and where you need to go to in the future. So conducting some sort of mapping exercise or gap analysis is a really good starting point for any organization. In this phase, you'll also need to start identifying what are the current climate risks and opportunities that are facing your organization. You'll also want to identify what are those current climate risks and opportunities facing the majority of your portfolio, the organizations you're giving loans to. Also at this stage, you can set a roadmap, which we discussed yesterday, which does often include starting with a TCFD team, and we'll discuss that momentarily. And also you want to look at updating or developing any climate policies or setting targets. Now, another key tip is to get internal buy-in. We talked yesterday about governance and how important it is to have that tone from the top, and that the governing board and the leadership and management of an organization is really part of the whole process. So there's a few key tips here too. We do think that it's really important to identify that financial impact in order to get the buy-in from the top. So really identifying those financial impacts of those risks and opportunities is key. Also, we highly recommend upskilling the board, the management, and the leadership, which you're doing today by having us here, but continuing to have that constant education within the organization is key to understanding those financial impacts. Also, we suggest bringing in external expertise where needed as you get started until you build up the internal capacity. And of course, to establish accountability incentives within the organization to ensure that there is some incentive to keep moving forward. Another tip that we recommend is, of course, collaboration. So we mentioned yesterday that when you get started on that roadmap, you might want to set up a TCFD team or climate team, and really making sure that it's a cross-functional team. Now, climate is really a whole of organization issue. So while sometimes it might be tempting to just set up the team in the finance team or maybe in another area of the organization, it's really important to recognize that climate change will have an impact on all the teams in the organization. So making sure that the TCFD team or climate team is really cross-functional, that it has people with expertise throughout the organization is really quite important. Also, making sure that you have a climate champion that's from the leadership or the board level is important to make sure that the governance structures are really in alignment with what the TCFD team is doing. We also suggest pooling expertise, knowledge, and experience, and actively engaging your clients as well, taking them on this journey with you as well. And now in that sense, we also suggest tip 4 to learn from others. You can learn from a lot of the clients in your portfolio, what they're doing, the technology they're developing, the different tools they're using. Also, in that sense, you can use a mapping table or an overview table to help communicate better these areas. You can also focus on strategic and financial implications for business. When you're learning from others, we highly recommend making use of the TCFD Knowledge Hub. On the Knowledge Hub, you can find other reports that have been prepared by your peers. You can select them by industry or by geography to see what others are doing in this area. And the final tip really is to just get started. Be sure to define your time horizons, but just get moving. You don't want perfection to be the enemy of the good. So really getting started, because as you start with the qualitative disclosures, you'll be able to build into more quantitative disclosures. So rather than waiting for having all those numbers to get started, it's important to start moving and building up that capacity bit by bit. Great. So with that, we have another little quiz.
May I just come in?
Yeah, sure, Lopa.
Right, yeah. So just for the benefit of our colleagues from the central bank, so Shakhawat Bhai and Zubair Bhai, as you draft the policy for sustainability reporting, so the point that I just want to reiterate again, which Tiffany mentioned, is to make sure that there is commitment from the tone at the top. So although the corporate governance guidelines are done by a different department, BRPD, but I think you can add in the touch points on the role of the board in making sure that there is total commitment from the board in ensuring that these disclosures happen. So I think
Yeah, this will not be a problem because this can be done with a consultation with the BRPD and also the in-charge governor. So that's not a big deal. But the formulate the policies and that will.
Ji, please go ahead.
Here?
Yeah, we can hear.
Yes. So I think the disclosures and the requirement from the board of the banks and financial institutions will not be a problem, because once we will finalize that this should be included in our policy, this will be disseminated with BRPD and the concerned deputy governors. So that will not be a problem.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. So then a quick quiz for you. So disclosure of material climate-related financial data should appear where? And maybe just discuss in the room which you think it is and let me know. The key here is material. So financially material, climate-related financial data.
Annual financial report, mainly. One and two. Mainly one and two. And also two. Yeah.
Well done. So we're very clear there. Then,
and website, when annual report will also go to the website. So
great.
directly, all are correct, but mainly one, and then the two, as one is a part of two.
Perfect. So you got it exactly right, and that one is the most important. All the others support the first one. So the more information you can give means the easier it is to find. What we're finding is a lot of people will start with their internal documents and they'll put just a few things on their website. The issue there is obviously investors can't access that information and often they can't find it on your website. So well done. If you can start with the annual financial reporting package, that is indeed the objective and something that the market should be encouraged to do. Great. So with that, let's discuss now risks and opportunities for banks particularly. So we did introduce what are these risks and opportunities yesterday. And as a reminder, we had physical risks and transition risks. And we're going to talk a lot about risk today because we're talking about risk management. But I also want to remind everyone of that report we discussed yesterday by CDP, the 2019 report called Major Risk or Rosy Opportunity. And just as a reminder that when they financially evaluated the risks and opportunities facing top listed companies, they found that the opportunities outweighed by 2.1 times the risks. So let's make sure that we don't forget those opportunities that are available. And even though we're talking a lot about risks today. But what do we mean by risks? So while keeping opportunities in mind, I think it is important to understand that the financial system is facing fairly large risks from climate change. We currently see here on the screen an overview from the Network for Greening the Financial System. And this really illustrates that risks could affect the economy and financial systems through really a range of transmission channels. And this overview also helps to understand impacts. So if you now look on the slide on the left side in this bright green color, we have the dichotomy of climate risks split into, again, transition risks and physical risks. Then in the middle, in the gray section, you see the different transmission centers, which take both a micro and a macro view. And then on the right side, on that turquoise color, or in other words, are financial impacts. So financial risks or financial impacts that we'll see. So if we want to take an example from this, we can look at transition risks. And if you focus on that one first, we can see how consumer preferences might be altering, which in a micro perspective affects businesses through changes in demand for certain products, which is then amplified by household changes such as changes in costs, and at the same time can influence employee satisfaction, impacting producing increased costs, which all create then a financial risk for lenders and investors at the same time. We can also look, for example, at the physical risks at the bottom on the left. And we see, for example, an increase in acute risks such as extreme weather events, which can then, through the transmission channels, have an impact on productivity at the macro level, but will also increase costs at the micro level for both households and businesses. And then for the financial side, the financial risk side, we see underwriting risks increasing as insuring assets may become more difficult or more costly, as physical risk can possibly lead to lower insurance coverage in some regions. Also, if you look at the bottom of this slide, we see little gray lines, and this is actually meant to show that it's a feedback cycle. So this really means that the financial impact then can then have an economic impact, but at the same time, those economic impacts at the of a country's transition will then interlink into the different categories as well. So it's a constant cycle, really, where we see these impacts enhancing each other. So a top question that we're often asked is, what are the risks and how do you measure those risks? Where should you focus your attention? And how do you actually prioritize the right industries, sectors, or portfolios? And this is why we bring you this slide here, which is from UNEP-FI's TCFD banking program, which we have a number of colleagues with us here today from that program. This is from a few years ago, and it was designed by the members of the UNEP-FI TCFD banking program. And at the time, it was really developed to help financial institutions to expand their toolkits for climate risk assessment and also to use it for disclosure purposes. Now, I think everyone knows well here that every sector really brings different challenges or obstacles with the green transition. And because portfolios are often quite diverse, UNEP-FI's banking program made a decision to come up with these 8 sectors in order to summarize their risk portfolio. So here you can see the ratings and a heat map for each of those 8 sectors. So we have oil and gas, agriculture, real estate, power generation, metals and mining, industrials, transportation, and service and technology. And the mapping therefore reflects a level of risk that the participants believed at the time are likely to occur from an ambitious or a just transition. Under the scenario of limiting the warming to well below 2 degrees, which is, of course, in alignment with the Paris Agreement. So a heat map is generally a really great tool for evaluating, disclosing, and managing your risk, where, of course, you want to identify those that have the highest risk and be sure that you have a strategy that addresses those high risks. Another interesting report that you should become familiar with if you're not already is this one by Carbon Tracker. As you may already know, it has been shown that in order to limit global warming relief to 1.5 degrees, an increase from pre-industrial temperatures, that 90% of fossil fuel reserves must actually remain in the ground. And that is where we refer to stranded assets. So this report, called Unburnable Carbon, 10 Years On, finds that the majority of embedded emissions are listed on stock exchanges of China, USA, India, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, where the exception of the USA, except for the USA, emissions are really dominated by partial listings of state-owned companies. So the report quantifies that the stranded asset risk exposure for the oil and gas assets finds that over $1 trillion US dollars of oil and gas assets risk becoming stranded. So they can't be taken out of the ground if we are to achieve 1.5 degrees. And the majority, about 600 billion of that, is held by listed companies. So in absolute terms, this stranded asset risk is really concentrated in certain financial centers that face exceeded risks related to listing of oil and gas assets. But let's not forget the opportunities again. And with that, in this last slide of this section, I wanted to go into the importance of the opportunities one more time. So to exemplify what we mean by opportunities, let's look at a real life example. This is an overview that's been published by a Canadian city, Calgary, in their climate resilience strategy document. We have on the left side of the circle here their mitigation strategies, which is really the city's strategies to reduce emissions. And on the right side, we have the option to manage the risks of climate impacts. And what I want to highlight here is the interplay or overlap between the mitigation and the adaptation strategies, which should be considered together. And if we look into that overlapping, that is where we build up climate resilience, which means in the future, if we successfully take action on both sides, we might come up with real solutions for water conservation, new energy systems, education, local food production, etc., creating more resilient markets. And again, this really is where the opportunities arise, is in that center. The TCFD further provides a few main categories of opportunities to help identify them, which, as a reminder from yesterday, are resource efficiency, energy sources, product and services, markets, and resilience. So there are a lot of real opportunities that arise, such as coming up with more efficient ways of transport. We can have more efficient product projections. We can adjust the distribution process, and due to the new technology, we can have different recycling programs or more efficient buildings. So these opportunities, if they're taken, can then lead to different financial impacts. And we can expect to see that companies start to capitalize on these opportunities, and they will then reduce operating costs, or production capacity can be increased because the systems are more lean and more efficient, for example. So with that overview of risks and opportunities that should be considered and evaluated, I will just remind everyone to review the risks and opportunity categories proposed by the TCFD as you get started, and to use the TCFD's supplemental guidance documents to help with identifying the financial impact that might result from these risks and opportunities. And with that, let's look at how to manage these risks. So this is the third pillar then of the TCFD. And as a reminder, we want to see them all interconnected, even though we're discussing them separately. So as a reminder, the risk management pillar tends to be a more qualitative pillar. Also, it's deemed to be financially material for all organizations. So all organizations should be looking at disclosing these three core TCFD risk management disclosures. So what we can see is that the risk management pillar contains three broad recommended disclosures, A, B, and C, which are the general disclosures, but they also have supplemental or additional recommendations for category A for banks specifically. So let's look first at category A. The recommended disclosure is about describing the process for risk management that allows for identifying and assessing climate risk. So all organizations should be considering disclosing how risks are identified, also explaining the methodology used. And for example, if you're not using the risk categories that are provided by the TCFD, you should explain why not and how you compare different risks to climate. In doing so, it's also, it should be understood by the report readers how regulation is considered when evaluating risks. And banks should, in addition, provide information on how risk categories are integrated or related to those traditional risk categories used by banks that we discussed yesterday. So credit risk, market risk, liquidity risk, and operational risk. So all of that is understanding how you identify and assess risks, particularly related to climate. Then if we look at category B, the next one down, this is...
Sorry, I would like to interrupt a little bit.
Sure.
From the category A, it says that it will identify and assess the climatic risk, if I'm not wrong.
Correct. Yeah.
And in category B, it will discuss about the risk management process.
Correct.
And in category C, we will integrate with the traditional risk. So
Correct.
in case of bank, why including traditional banking industry risk categories and risk classification framework in the assessment and identification of risk category A? Am I clear?
I'm not sure of your question. Can you repeat the question?
Yes, my question is that integration on the category C, if
Yeah.
I'm not wrong. But why you are mentioning in the identification and assessment in the category A that the bank will regarding the traditional banking industry risk?
Because in category A, we're looking at the identification and assessment process. So that's specifically what TCFD wants you to identify. So when you're looking at traditional banking industry risks, what they want the report reader or the investor to understand is how do you identify within traditional banking categories such as credit risk, how do you identify the particular climate aspect of that? Whereas the integration,
Okay.
which I'll get to momentarily, the integration is more understanding how climate risk is seen within the holistic risk management. So maybe I'll continue to integration and it might become a little bit more clear. Is that okay?
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
No problem. So then if we look at B for the risk management process, here we're really focusing on how the organization manages and particularly prioritizes its risks. So in the information on how decisions are made and or going to be made. And as we heard in part 1 in the governance section, we were asked to provide insight into who is actually doing what and who's responsible for assuring that risks are effectively managed. In this section, we're really trying to understand what are the processes being used and particularly how prioritizations are being made. So often we'll see kind of a mapping here where we map different risks and we understand how we prioritize different risks. So particularly in B, we want to understand what decisions were made to mitigate, transfer, accept, or control risks, and how you prioritize and how you define materiality here. Then in category C, we're really trying to understand that integration into your holistic risk management process. Two important things to understand here to really understand that integration is understanding that there's kind of two specific things we need to know about climate. One is that climate is a non-diversifiable risk, meaning that it's widespread, that it'll affect all organizations, although it affects them in very different ways. It also affects all parts of your own organization, although it affects it in very different ways. So we should be considering climate risk along with all of our other risks. However, there's one different thing about climate, as we discussed before, and that's the time horizons. So often we need to make decisions and make action today that will have an impact quite far in the future. So it doesn't fit perfectly with all of our other risk management processes. So it's important that we communicate with our report readers how we've identified climate to fit within that, but how we're also addressing the different time horizons that come from climate change. So I hope that's a bit more clear that in A, what we're really looking at is that identification of risks and the assessment process of risks. In B, we're understanding how our processes are in place, how we're prioritizing what risks to manage and what to mitigate, what to accept, and what to control. And in C, we're looking at how climate fits within the holistic risk management process, taking into consideration the different time horizons that we have with climate. So just to reiterate here how everyone's doing in the banking sector, as you can see here, this is again from the TCFD 2022 status report. And as we heard in part 1, the status report did come from a review of hundreds of public reports using artificial intelligence to help understand to what extent companies are aligning their disclosure with the recommendations of the TCFD. So I highly recommend looking at that report, but what I do want to highlight here from a high level is that we see strong growth in all three recommended disclosures in this category in risk management. But in risk management C, the integration into the overall risk management, we've seen the biggest increase. In all categories, actually. So this is significant because it's the greatest increase in disclosure from 2019 to 2021 of all 11 recommended disclosures, which is an increase of 20%, I believe. Great. So I'm gonna skip over this and let you review it on your own time because we're quite short on time now, but just to emphasize that we often get the question of where does climate fit within the ESG? And while we often see, of course, climate within the environmental sector, just to note that as we've seen with the risks and opportunities, it has then an impact on the social and governance side as well. So it's important to see climate going beyond, of course, just the environmental sector, because it has an important impact on our employees, on our clients, on our portfolio, as well as in our governance structure. Now, I just want to go through a couple examples. I'm sorry, we're a little bit over on time, but I think we can make up for it a little bit later. But I think this will make it a little bit more concrete. So the first example here is a disclosure from HDFC, which is an Indian bank, and it is taken from their sustainability report. What I think is really done nicely here is that they really try to lay out those anticipated risks exactly as categorized by the TCFD. And while this is just a snapshot from the transition risk side, if you do take a moment to look at this report, you will see that they also did the same for the physical risk side. What I'll highlight here is that they not only describe what the risks are that they identified, but more importantly, in alignment with the recommendations of the TCFD, they are also describing how the company identifies those and how they actually manage those risks. So for example, we can see here that the operational risk management department did design tools and techniques for identification and monitoring of operation risks. And we can see that from this table of anticipated risks associated with climate change, where they identified the risks as well as how they are managing that risk. We can read in the first risk, for example, legal risk, that all large projects are required to comply with an environmental laws, which is a policy that they put in place in order to manage these risks. What I also think is interesting to see in the snapshot here is how we can see the interconnectedness of the different pillars. So we are getting the information on which committees have been set up, which are pertaining to the governance disclosure recommendations, but we're also learning how that management process works, giving us more information about the risk itself, which is part of the risk management pillar. So as I mentioned before, even though we're discussing these pillars separately, often they can be disclosed all together, and they should be disclosed where it makes most sense within the report. So here's another example from ABN AMRO, which is a Dutch bank, and they've integrated aspects into their annual report using integrated reporting. And this example really illustrates how their sustainability risk policy framework is integrated into their enterprise risk management framework using a risk taxonomy. What's particularly good here is that it defines conditions under which the bank's business generally works. And what I do want to highlight is that while sustainability risk is considered a financial risk, they show that some aspects of TCFD's risk categories go beyond financial risks into operational or non-financial risks, such as legal risks and behavioral risks. So TCFD would be addressed beyond just that sustainability risk component. Also, interestingly, ABN AMRO indicated in 2022 that they assessed the materiality of climate-related and environmental risks in relation to traditional risk types. The initial assessment was qualitative, and for some risk types, this was further substantiated quantitatively, whereby a distinction between materiality in the short term, which they define as 1 year, and then the medium term, which they define as 5 years, and the long term, which they define as 30 years, was made where possible. So to ensure then consistency across risk types, they looked at a set of predefined events, including climate-related risk events such as floods and droughts, which are physical risks, and policy and technology development, which is a transition risk, as well as environmental risk events, more physical risks, and policy and technology development, or transition risks. And they further discuss this in the report with the outcomes of the assessment on how they plan to mitigate those risks. So you might want to take a look again at this example in more detail to understand that assessment that they went through. And so our, I think, second last example here is from a Brazilian bank, and we are looking here at the annual report of Banco do Brasil. And they're showing a materiality matrix, which I mentioned we might often see from category 2 of the risk management. And it really helps us to understand how risks have been identified, assessed, and then more importantly, prioritized is what we see here. And this is really a very common way to illustrate that prioritization, especially for companies that use the GRI standards for their impact reporting, as they'll already be conducting a similar exercise. So something that's done very nicely here is showing that prioritization of risks and how they identify these risks. And just to highlight is they provide a very clear description in their report of how they reached this final image. That's really essential because this mapping is not really sufficient if we don't understand how you got to that final map. So what they did is they did a cycle of consultations with all of their primary stakeholders. And they mentioned that they really gained through different consultation surveys, a lot of information of where different stakeholders see different risks and how they emerge for different stakeholders. So you may want to read this report to learn how another bank might be conducting their stakeholder consultation. And then for the final example, just to flag a few interesting points here while being conscious of the time, you may also want to check out this report because in particular, they look at in their risk management section, and this is from the 2021 Bank of China Corporate Social Responsibility Report. They show that process from environmental risk factors, both transition and physical risks, through to the financial impact on the bank. And as recommended by the TCFD guidance for banks, they illustrate how these impacts are traditionally evaluated through credit risk, operational risk, market risk, and liquidity risk. So you can read this report to show exactly how another one of your peers is looking at that. Now, I'm going to skip these slides because we briefly discussed them yesterday, but if you have any questions on the 2023 Climate Risk Landscape Report, you have the team here that developed this report, so please ask us questions. But this is a really great tool as you're getting started to manage those risks, as it points you to all the many tools that you can make use of. And with that, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Vanina, who's going to take us through the metrics and targets pillar. Over to you, Vanina.
Thank you, Tiffany. So hi, everyone. Like yesterday, Vanina, Tiffany's colleague, thank you for joining us today. So before the break, I will go over the final pillar with you, the metrics and targets pillar. And I'll try not to go too much over the break. So just as a reminder, and you've seen this graph before, the metrics and targets pillar of the TCFD is that very inner layer here in gray of the TCFD, and all of the other pillars of the TCFD are really underpinned by these appropriate metrics and targets. As Tiffany was mentioning earlier, these are developed and created through that materiality lens. These metrics and targets need to be grounded in climate information that is financially material. And this fourth pillar is about disclosing the metrics and targets used to assess and manage climate-related risks and opportunities. Now, let's break this down into the 3 disclosures that are recommended by the TCFD. So first, we see the metrics category. So that's the A box, the first row. So we have a list of cross-industry metrics that are important for all organizations to disclose on transition risks, physical risks, climate-related opportunities, internal carbon prices, and remuneration. And then with these, it's also important to disclose any sort of assumptions or methodologies used to come up with the metrics that you're disclosing. And there is specific guidance for banks here. So 3 pieces of guidance on metrics. Firstly, banks should report on the metrics for their lendings, financial intermediary business activities. Secondly, they should report on their carbon-related assets. And then thirdly, it's recommended that banks report on their performance in aligning with a 2-degree or lower scenario. And here, it's important to make sure to connect strategy disclosures and risk management disclosures with metrics. So you have to disclose how you're using a scenario analysis to inform the sort of metrics that you're developing and how you're tracking that over time. Now let's go in the second row, the box B. So this is the second area of metrics and targets disclosures, and it specifically hones in on those greenhouse gas emissions, because those are very important in relation to climate change and are specific metrics that the TCFD deems to be financially material to all organizations. So in other words, you have to disclose how many emissions are in your portfolio, how many will have a financial impact on any bank. And here it's recommended that all companies, even beyond banks, should disclose Scope 1, Scope 2, and if relevant, Scope 3, using the greenhouse gas protocol that's the preferred methodology from the TCFD. Let's explain what these 3 scopes are. So the first scope, Scope 1, are direct emissions, those that a company causes.
It is.
Yes, you have a question?
No.
Okay.
It's okay.
Okay, I continue. So I was talking about the first scope. So these are direct emissions that the company causes by operating the things that it owns or controls. So these emissions can be a result of heating buildings and powering computers. Then Scope 2, these are indirect emissions. So they are created by the production of the energy that an organization buys. And then we have Scope 3. These are also indirect emissions, meaning those not produced by the company itself, but they differ from Scope 2 because they cover those produced by customers using the company's products or the emissions produced by suppliers making products that the company uses, so, and the supply chain. And you may note that I said that companies should disclose, if relevant, Scope 3, but for banks, the Scope 3 emissions are likely going to be highly relevant. So it's important that banks should look at all of the 3 scopes, not just the first 2. And with that, there's specific guidance for banks to report on greenhouse gas emissions from lending and other financial intermediary business activities using the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, typically referred to as the PCAF methodology. So now let's talk about the last row, that's the box C. The final recommended disclosure for the spiller is the targets that are being set. And this recommended disclosure, it's recommended that all companies should report on long-term as well as interim targets, considering absolute and intensity-based calculations, timeframes, base years, and key performance indicators. So just to clarify, we sometimes get questions about absolute versus intensity emissions. And absolute emissions are the gross overall emissions associated with an organization, whereas intensity emissions refer to an organization's emission relative to some sort of economic output, such as revenue. And then again, with the targets, as the others, we see that it's important that you report and disclose what methodologies you're using to come up to the conclusions that you are around targets. Now, let's have a look at this 2022 status report that we've already talked about. we see some of the progress on all of the 3 recommended disclosures I just mentioned over the year. So I'd like to particularly highlight this more drastic increase in the disclosure of climate-related targets. So the last row in the table I just talked about. And that indicates that companies are really recognizing the importance of setting these targets to manage the risks and opportunities that they might be identifying. Let's now have a look at some examples. So hopefully this is more concrete. This is an example from a South African bank, Standard Bank Group, and it shows how they reported to reflect the impact of climate-related risks in their credit portfolio. What I like to highlight here in the table is that they have metrics for sectors with elevated transition risk exposures, such as coal-fired power generation, that's here in the first row, and oil and gas. They also have metrics for sectors with elevated physical risk, specifically looking at the agriculture sector here in the second row, which is very vulnerable to both acute and chronic risks. And in the last row, that's really important here because they disclose metrics for opportunities by looking specifically into opportunities created through climate mitigation in the renewable sector. Now here we have an example from the Bank of China's 2021 CSR report, and I like to focus on the diagram on the right-hand side. And we see the proportion of total credits to brown industries. You see what it entails. And it accounts for 10% of the corporate loans. And this helps us to understand the exposure of the Bank of China's lending to high-risk sectors and how they're really performing and managing these risks over time. And you have a description on the left, which I'll leave to you to read on your own. And this is an example of the Bank of England's, and it's their roadmap for reaching net zero. This provides for banks and other financial institutions a clear picture of the sort of pace and direction of travel for the UK financial system. This is a pathway. This pathway and other jurisdictional pathways could be used to help inform your own interim and long-term targets to manage these risks. So I'll leave this slide for you to review also. And we're reaching this example. Oops. I don't know about, yeah, sorry, my image is a little bit. Anyway, so this is an example that comes from the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development from their 2021 TCFD reports. And they provide a historical record of annual green finance commitment. And you see how it's growing over time. So it also shows us in both absolute terms as well as relative terms or intensity based. And as recommended, this target is in alignment with the strategy of the bank, as well as comes with the metrics and explanation of how it is calculated. So you have the link here on the right. You can check the description also. So here, I think it was the last example. So it's time for the break. We're a little bit over. So it's 10, yeah, it's past 3. So please come back in 5 minutes. So it will be past 7. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat or during the break. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Just returning back. Hopefully everyone's back and you can hear me. Just want to check in with you.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Okay, so welcome back. I just want to now move on to the next section, which would be setting net zero targets. And so we're going to start off this section with a short video. And Vanina, could you help by playing the video to get started to introduce this topic? Thank you.
Scorching heat waves, record wildfires, rising seas. These consequences of climate change are hitting us already and will do so much harder in the future. To avoid the worst climate impacts, global greenhouse gas emissions need to be slashed in half by 2030 and reach net zero around mid-century. The term net zero gets thrown around a lot these days, but what is it and how can we get there? Reaching net zero emissions requires us to do two things. First, we must reduce our emissions to as close to zero as possible, as quickly as possible. Phasing out coal, investing in clean energy, shifting to electric vehicles, protecting forests, and reducing food loss and waste are just a few ways to shrink our carbon footprint. Second, we need to pull just as much carbon out of the atmosphere as we pump into it. This can be done by planting trees, which absorb carbon into their trunks, limbs, and roots, as well as by deploying emerging technologies, such as direct air capture, which takes carbon out of the air and stores it in geological formations underground. A number of countries have already committed to reach net zero emissions by 2050, and some nations are even more ambitious. For example, Norway plans to reach net zero by 2030, and Finland by 2035. In 2020, all countries should put forward stronger national climate commitments that put us on a path to collectively reach net zero emissions by 2050. And in this process, they will ensure a bright future for our children and all life on Earth.
Great. So yeah, I think that's a good introduction to this section. And just to kind of introduce this topic of net zero target setting, I think it's very important that we understand what we're talking about, because there's a lot of terms that can alter from one jurisdiction to another, and over time the term is used in different ways. So just, you know, to define the term net zero, the IPCC and the Race to Zero on the website have one single definition, which is net zero carbon dioxide CO2 emissions are achieved when anthropogenic or human created CO2 emissions are balanced globally by equal CO2 removals over a specific period. And net zero CO2 emissions are also referred to as carbon neutrality. So this is really that when emissions of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are balanced out by the removal over a specific period. And what does that mean? So the interpretation is that although we do need to reduce the emissions to zero, we can still emit greenhouse gases at close to zero as long as we're balancing them out by removing the emissions as well, as was mentioned in the video. So the important thing is to equally remove the same amount, and that's an important point to mention. And the second point to mention is that in the Paris Agreement, the IPCC has set the limit of global warming to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial level, and to pursue an effort of 1.5 degrees warming. So this is in line with the latest climate science. But the question is always why 1.5, and does it really make a big difference if we have 2? It's just a slight 0.5 increase, but just 0.5 degrees. Sorry, let me just to the next slide. Yeah, but just that 0.5 degrees is actually quite significant in terms of impact. According to an IPCC special report, close to 3 times as many people would be regularly exposed to extreme heat in a 1.5 degree scenario. And sorry, a 2 point. 2.0 degree scenario. Also, we would lose twice as many plants and vertebrate species and 3 times as many insects. Marine fisheries would see catches decline twice as much, which is 3 million metric tons, than that of a 1.5 degree scenario. And you can see in this graphic the significant changes between the 2 warming scenarios. Also, crop yields could decline more than twice as much in some areas, threatening worldwide food security. So every bit of this warming has consequences for both planetary and human health. And you can see directly in this graphic the differences, such as ice-free Arctic summers every 10 years at 2 degrees as opposed to every 100 in a 1.5 degree scenario. Nearly a doubling of increased flood risks from 100 to 170%. Populational exposure to severe heat waves increase from 1 to 2.7 billion. Sea level rise will affect millions more, and there are also substantially more ocean productivity loss, and that at 2 degrees scenario, greater than 99% of the world's coral reefs will be lost, compared to a lower limit of 70% possibility in a 1.5 degree scenario. So this is all to say that it is better, obviously, not to pollute in the first place, and that these rapid and deep cuts in emissions are a priority within the next decade. But in order to achieve this 1.5 degree scenario by 2050, these emissions reductions are necessary, but also not sufficient. So with the 1.5 degree scenario, it involves actively removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to balance out hard to mitigate residual emissions, as mentioned in the video. And there are emerging and somewhat established technological solutions in this area, such as carbon capture and storage, though this might be a longer term solution given the problems of scalability and cost, but these technologies are also improving at a rapid rate. Though we do know one thing for sure is that the land and nature-based carbon dioxide removal options, such as forest and mangrove restoration, is an immediate and far more cost-efficient solution than technological ones in the short term. So we just want to balance out these approaches and take a portfolio approach of deep reductions of carbon emissions in our global energy transition and carbon removals through nature and technology. So these are essential by mid-century 2050 to achieve 1.5 degrees. And so we're just going to walk through now the overview of setting these net zero targets in the long term. And this is going to be based on the Science-Based Target Initiative, which you may have heard of, the SBTi. And so these play a vital role in driving down the greenhouse gas emissions and building a resilient net zero economy, which is also grounded in science. So this SBTi, for those who haven't heard, is a global body established in 2015 with the goal of enabling companies and financial institutions to set ambitious emissions reductions targets in line with the latest climate science. So this is a collaboration between CDP, the UN Global Compact, and the World Resource Institute and WWF. And they seek to achieve ambitious climate action in the private sector. And their goals are defining and promoting best practice science-based target setting, offering resources and guidance to reduce the barriers through adoption, and independently assess and validate the targets of companies and financial institutions. So looking at how to achieve net zero, it's important to note that for a robust net zero strategy, firms need to identify and understand the key steps in this process. So companies can take a variety of approaches to developing near-term and long-term science-based targets, but however, we're just going to walk through the SBTi recommendations. And so the first step in this process would be selecting a base year. So companies need to establish a base year to track emissions performance consistently and meaningfully over the target period. And here you must also ensure that scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions data are accurate and verifiable. The base year emissions should also be representative of a company's typical greenhouse gas profile. And the base year should be chosen so that targets have sufficient forward-looking ambition. And this base year must be no earlier than 2015. And so the second would be calculating your company's emissions. So the recommendation here is that companies ensure the target boundary is aligned with the greenhouse gas inventory boundary, and that it also determines how to treat subsidiaries, that it also excludes the use of carbon credits and avoided emissions, and determines how to treat indirect use phase emissions. So for example, these are emissions that are generated by products that only consume energy indirectly during use over their expected lifetime. So a concrete example of that would be, the washing and drying of apparel from manufacturers, and the cooking and refrigeration of food products for food retailers. And to note, this is also a optional category. And you can see on the link at the bottom here that it has the full target setting process, where you can take a look to go through all the technicalities of this target setting process. We're just giving a high level overview now. And so the next category now would be setting target boundaries. So these differ from near-term and long-term target setting. Fourth would be choosing a target year. And just as a reminder, for TCFD, you're recommended to provide targets as well as interim targets, which the SBTi sees as near-term and long-term targets. And lastly, you have the calculation of targets. And for the TCFD, it's important to report that report readers understand how you calculate this. So you can, like I said, you can see this extensive resource for target setting at the bottom of the screen if you want to look further into this. So going on to the target setting guidance provided by the TCFD, what makes effective targets. This illustrates why interim targets are so important, especially when you're setting the net zero targets, such as 2050 targets, which are often quite far in the future. So the pathways that you can see on the graph, these are adapted from the NGFS scenario database. And what you can see basically is that when a firm is committing to reduce scope 1 and 2 emissions, and also putting net zero targets in place by 2050, there are different pathways that can be followed based on the different scenarios analyzed. So for this reason, they show the pathway they currently plan to follow and the interim targets that they have set based on that selected pathway. And TCFD also gives guidance on how effective targets should be established, which you can see on the left-hand side here. And the first part is very important and recommends that targets should be linked to your strategy and risk management frameworks, goals. It should always be linked to the relevant metrics, which means that these metrics need to be quantifiable, understandable, and trusted and verifiable. So they should be periodically reviewed and updated. So this is essential because, just despite the climate science having improved significantly, and also the fact that climate change is unpredictable, there could be situations where trigger points could lead to a shift in expectations. So you need to always constantly review as there's gaps in the relevant science, and there could be changes over time. So this might also require a change in targets or even new metrics being introduced over time. So also in addition to this, companies are also concerned about the legal aspects of being held liable to these targets. So it's also very important to provide the full context on how and why these targets have been selected and what the objectives of them are. So moving forward, I won't go too deep into this slide because it is quite technical, and it's definitely here as a resource for you. But I'll go over the methodologies and basic premise of these 3 methods of target setting. So just to get an understanding, the first is absolute finance emissions, which includes inclusion of all subsectors as well as aggregation across all sectors. So this measures the financial institution's share of borrowers' emissions. And at a portfolio level, this metric is calculated by summing up the absolute finance emissions of the borrowers in the portfolio. The second would be physical emissions intensity. This measures a borrower's emissions per unit of production. So for example, the number of megawatt hours or megajoules of energy produced. And at the portfolio level, physical emissions intensity measures the exposure weighted average of the physical emissions intensities of the borrowers in the portfolio. And lastly, we have the finance emissions lending intensity, which is the borrower's absolute finance emissions to an emission intensity metric. So this metric is based on the amount of financing committed to the borrower's sector. And at a portfolio level, this metric is calculated by dividing the sector portfolio's absolute finance emissions by the total sector financing. But feel free to look at the TCFD's metrics and targets guidance for further information and guidance on this aspect. And quickly, I just want to go through a couple target setting examples by banks so you can see what they actually look like in practice. So this one is from Citibank within their disclosures. There you can see here there's a robust framework for or pathway for setting and achieving their targets. So you recognize these steps, which were recently discussed, including calculating emissions in determining what is their baseline and starting point. And in step 2, they looked into identifying different emissions reduction pathways. So we mentioned NGFS, but in this case, they're using the IEA, that International Energy Agency scenarios. So I know it's important that the institution determine whatever fits the market or the portfolio best, and can be on an institutional basis, which scenarios to decide to use. And from there, they decide some target setting processes. So what do they want to see from 2030 and beyond? So this is the number 3 on the steps category on the left. And then steps 4 and 5 are also very important, as it is the implementation of the strategy and engaging with external clients. And so this is a very important aspect as well, to have that external engagement as well as the internal engagement. So this is a long-term strategy. So decarbonization is really like a marathon, and institutions have to have the right tools in place to be planning long-term. And so the key aspect here in box 5, like I mentioned, the external, is to, one aspect that I mentioned before is avoiding potential litigation and criticism. Although not entirely unavoidable, this could be a strategy for mitigating this risk. So in the bottom of this page, you can see here there are 2 sectors based on the heat map analysis, highlighting 2 priority sectors they want to focus on. So the first one is energy. You can see that they include scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions as their key metrics, and they have a baseline year of 2020. And again, it's up to the firm to come up with their baseline, but it should be considered a normal year for comparison purposes. So just quickly, one more example here. We have Barclays, and this is the last slide of the net zero target setting topic. And so looking here at Barclays, you can see this is from their 2022 climate strategy report. And they're sharing what they have done and what they've announced in terms of target setting. And they had initially a 80% greenhouse gas emissions target from their own operations to source 90% of their electricity needs from renewable sources, covering scope 1 and 2. But they actually overshot this target and have achieved 86% emissions reductions from their own operations and 94% renewable energy resourced from their in their operations. And so they, in the wake of this, they shared a new announcement of 90% greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2025. So in the bottom there, you can also see some portfolio targets. So they have put in place absolute emissions targets, and they're targeting a reduction of 15% against the baseline of 2020 by the year 2025. And they also set interim targets for 2030. So they just want to reduce 40% of absolute emissions for the energy sector. And they take a similar approach to Citibank in the power sector, as they're using emission intensity reduction targets. So these are just two examples. Feel free to go back and walk through these and look through the technicalities and the details later. But we just wanted to give you an introduction to these and give you a few concrete examples. And so I will now leave it to my colleague Zhongyi, who will now take you through transition planning. So over to you, Zhongyi.
Yes, thank you very much, Drew. So after seeing how to set net zero targets, let's move on to the next part, which is the transition plan making. So when we are setting that net zero target, I think we will have become clear that setting a target requires a plan to achieve the target. These commitments inherently and in some cases explicitly require a plan, and many organizations are already preparing such plans. From its consultation on metrics, targets, and transition plans, the task force found 2/3 of the respondents had either developed a transition plan or plan to do so in the next year. And with another 22% reporting they plan to develop the transition plan in the future. As we can see here, organizations' transition plans are of particular interest to users, especially when they are seeking to verify the credibility of organizations' commitments related to climate change. Users are particularly interested in the information the information on how organizations will adjust their strategies or business models, including the specific actions they will take to reduce risks and increase opportunities as they transition to a low carbon economy. And also, still on the same page, the TCFD highlights certain key practices that should be considered when developing a transition plan. They are, firstly, aligned with strategy. A transition plan should be part of and aligned with an organization's broader activities for addressing climate-related risks and opportunities, which in turn should be a part of and aligned with the organization's overall business strategy. And secondly, a transition plan should be credible and contain sufficient information to enable users to assess its credibility. For example, the plan should describe the organization's current capabilities, technologies, transition pathways, and financial plan. Organizations may also want to describe significant limitations, constraints, and uncertainties in the transition plan, such as challenges regarding greenhouse gas emissions, reductions of hard to decarbonize sectors. And thirdly, a good transition plan should be anchored in quantitative elements, including climate-related metrics and targets. A transition plan should be designed to consider and help achieve specific targets in an organization's planned transition to a low-carbon economy. Progress against the organization's targets should be regularly tracked using appropriate metrics. The transition plan should also be consistent with broader economy or sector-wide science-based pathways to a low-carbon economy. And next, a good transition plan should also be actionable, specific initiatives. A transition plan can articulate specific initiatives and actions the organization will undertake to effectively execute the transition plan, including regular milestones. For example, the transition plan may articulate how an organization plans to reduce Scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions by investing in new technologies and processes, or by encouraging suppliers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in their operations. And moving forward, in the fifth point, we would also prefer a periodically reviewed and updated transition plan. A transition plan should be reviewed at least every 5 years and updated if necessary. Organizations should review their transition plans in line with their review process for their climate-related targets in order to ensure continued relevancy and efficiency to an organization's overall strategy planning process. And the sixth expectation for a good transition plan is the one who is reported annually to stakeholders. Organizations should report publicly or to stakeholders their initial transition plans and significant updates to the plans. In addition, organizations should report progress against their transition plans annually and include a comparison of completed actions to planned actions in the prior reporting period. And the last message delivered here by TCFD guideline is that the transition plans should also be subject to effective governance processes. A transition plan should describe the approval process, oversight, and accountability responsibilities within an organization, including the role of board and senior management level in overseeing the plan. So moving on to the next slide, which is an example of Dutch asset management firm and their roadmap for their transition plan. It shows the decarbonization pathway actually, and it lists the measures to be taken for each 5 year from 2015 to 2030. The baseline is set in 2019. And they set the net zero target for year 2050. The commitments here are to reduce emissions from the investment portfolio and operation by 30 and 25% respectively by 2025 and by 50% by 2030. That means for the last 20 years, there is still a 50% reduction to make. It's relevant here to note that there's a distinction between emission from the investment portfolio and the operation. And primarily, scope 3 is much higher and more challenging for financial institution or an investor asset management to manage, and it requires a different approach, such as investing in climate finance, thereby tilting your portfolio or direct investment in companies committed to transition or lower their emissions. We see here that Rebecca have 6 areas of action illustrated in the lower left corner. And then, as we all know, financial institutions support the real economy by allocating capital and providing relevant service to firms. GFANZ is the acronym for Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and it was launched at COP26 in Glasgow in 2021, and today counts over 500 financial institutions that have committed to the net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, in line with the goal of Paris Agreement, limiting the global warming to 1.5 Celsius degrees. And to support an orderly transition to net zero, GFANZ believes that financial institutions should redirect the capital to encourage ambitious and credible net zero strategies and emissions reduction by their clients and portfolio companies. A net zero transition plan is a set of goals, actions, and of course, accountability mechanisms to align an organization's business activities with a pathway to net zero greenhouse gas emissions that for sure delivers real economy emissions reductions in line with achieving global net zero. In the case of GFANZ members, a transition plan must be consistent with achieving net zero by 2050. At the latest, in line with the global efforts to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels with low or no overshoot. It is quite similar to some of the things we have seen for TCFD reporting. So the foundation is that there should be a bank-wide net zero commitment with targets, timelines, and priorities. And it will be translated into an implementation strategy, which will align business activities with a net zero target strategy, working with clients and industry companies, but also peers and the broader society and governance to support the real economy transition. It will require metrics and targets to assess and monitor progress and good governance with clear roles and responsibilities to oversight, as just we saw under the TCFD framework. And then the GFAN's 2022 reports, which is recommendations and guidance on financial institution net zero transition plans, outline 4 key approaches to progress transition to net zero in the real economy. They can be seen as relating to 4 types of companies: providers for climate solutions, companies that are 1.5 degrees Celsius aligned, companies that need to transition to 1.5 degrees 1.5 degrees Celsius aligns and before their end of life. They can also consider how to reward companies that are 1.5 degrees Celsius aligned, for instance, by providing cheaper funding. For high emitting clients, the bank can help these develop and finance their transition plan. And then there will eventually also be assets for clients where it may be necessary to divest. So moving on to the next slide. Before ending our session today, we have an activity to taste a bit of your knowledge now on transition plans and help you to think through the different strengths and drawbacks of different strategies, such as those outlined in the previous slides. So with that, I will hand over to my colleague Tiffany, and she will guide you through the test activity.
Great. Thanks so much, Song-Yi. So we do have a moment to be able to try this exercise out. So if, just like yesterday, you want to just pull up that Menti on your phone, I just checked it, it should be working. So you can either point your camera at that QR code on your screen, or you can just type in www.menti.com. And the code you need to enter to be able to access the question would be 77542653. And what you're going to get is on your screen, you'll get a question that then says, which strategy mix is best suited for your organization when considering the short term? So when we're thinking up to 2025, would you consider engaging with high emitting clients? Would you consider divestment from high emitting clients, maybe financing for the transition of high emitting clients, or expansion of financing climate solutions such as carbon removal or bioenergy? So I'll give you just a moment to fill that in on the Menti, and I'll share my screen when I see a few of you have started to answer the question. If you're struggling to access it, just let us know. Okay, we've seen a few come through. I'll give you just a moment more and I'll share my screen so you can see the answers that are coming through here. Great, so as you can see, we have a few different options here. So the one that's currently winning looks like it moves back and forth. So 3 are all combined for the short term. This is a really interesting result, actually. So collectively, the six of you that have participated so far have selected divestment from high emitting clients. You've selected financing for the transition to high emitting clients, and you've selected expansion of financing climate. I'm just going to open the chat in case we get any questions here, but okay, a few are coming out ahead at more divestment and then financing. But the one that's falling the least behind, engagement with high emitting clients, is actually the one I would most recommend for the short term. So if you keep in mind, in the short term, we have to think about what tools we have available for short-term strategy, so up to 2025. Now, of course, you could divest from high emitting clients, but it is possible that those high emitting clients are going to transition their own strategies. They might develop new technology, they might change their supply chain, they might become very, resilient companies. So divesting from them might actually lose out on the opportunity of those clients shifting to suit the lower carbon economy. You might be able to indeed finance the transition to high emitting clients. And I think that's, of course, a really good strategy at the beginning if they're getting started already. So you have to find those high emitting clients that are already getting started on this. And of course, you can expand your financing to climate solutions, but of course, we're still just starting to develop that technology. So it might not be, the only solution for the short term. The best solution, I think, for the short term is really engaging those high emitting clients so that you can work on them in the medium and the long term, and make sure that your money is going to be continually increasing and that the economic impact is going to be great. So let's then look at short term now that we've discussed that, or a medium term. Now that we've discussed the short term, what might you move into a different strategy you might select in the medium term? And I'll give you all a moment to fill that in.
আলোচনা শুনতে চাচ্ছে তো expansion of financing solutions. Three and 4.
So you're thinking 3 and 4. So yes, we're seeing 3 and 4 winning out. The first one, yeah, I would definitely agree. 3 and 4 are probably your best options when you're now going into the medium term. In the medium term, you might, as some of you have selected, still be engaging with high emitting clients. That'll depend, of course, on the progress of each of those clients. And I'm sure there'll still be some to engage with to try to push them to work more on their own transition plans. However, again, divestment might not quite yet be the time because there might be that opportunity of companies shifting. The best strategy in the medium term may be then financing those clients that you are engaging in the short term. You can start to then finance that transition for them, creating, green loan opportunities, bonds, etc. And then also expansion of financing climate solutions, because in the medium term, we might start to see more of those technologies that you can start to finance. Okay, so let's go on to the long term then. So if we're looking 2040 and beyond, what are the strategies that you think you might want to be using at that point? Okay, we've got a couple coming through. And I 100% agree with those of you who've already started. So engagement's probably too late at this point. So if we're looking long-term, if your high emitting clients haven't started to take any action at this point, it's really start it's time to start taking your money out of those companies. So divestment really comes into play in the long term. However, as many of you noted, you likely at this point will really be able to expand your financing into those climate solutions. The technology should be advanced much more at that point. We'll have a little more proof of concept. We'll be able to understand which are more risky opportunities and which are more resilient and sustainable opportunities in terms of new technology, such as carbon removals or bioenergy. So indeed, for the long term, I think the majority of you really have a good mindset on that in terms of divestment as well as expansion of financing. So basically, you're shifting your portfolio at that point. But just the key point here is that in the early stages, we can have a different strategy, and it shouldn't be our forever strategy. We should be looking at shifting our strategy over time, which is really what that transition plan is for. So Vanina, if you'd like to take back sharing of the screen, we'll get back to our slides then. Great, thanks so much for that. Okay, so I hope that exercise made a little bit more clear what a transition plan is and how it kind of changes over time. So remember, it is a plan. It's not something that it's not a strategy we leave exactly the same and then continue on. So that's really the end of our content today, but we wanted to leave you again with a number of resources that you can make use of as you continue on your learning journey and as you start to integrate this into your market. So in the first instance, I really do highly recommend making use of the numerous TCFD publications that have been developed to help your organization to disclose climate-related financial information and to help you also to guide your clients and your market on this topic. As a reminder, in addition to the recommended disclosures report, which was launched in 2017, but then updated in 2021, the FSB also developed an implementation guide that was updated as well in 2021 and supplemental guidance on metrics and targets, on risk management integration and disclosure, and on scenario analysis. And all of these can be found on the website noted on the slide. And also you can find all these resources on the TCFD Knowledge Hub. Also, if you'd like to review the basics of TCFD, you're welcome to watch our pre-recorded session on the SSE's website or some of the previous sessions specifically for banks on the SSE's YouTube channel. So our general training on TCFD is called TCFD 101, which is an introduction to climate-related financial disclosures, and TCFD 102, which builds experience on all four pillars through a number of examples. And all of these recordings can be found both on our SSE website and on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to make use of that TCFD Knowledge Hub. It also has CPD certified training on a number of different aspects of climate-related financial disclosure. And as you continue along your climate disclosure journey, I really recommend getting to know this website well. As you can see here, there's training on the very basics of TCFD, but then going beyond that, such as an introduction to scenario analysis, biodiversity related scenarios, or water related disclosures, etc. So please make use of that website. Just to note that the ISSB, which the TCFD is being absorbed by the ISSB, they're also developing a similar hub. So all of this information will stay publicly available. Some additional resources. So if you're looking for guidance specifically for banks and for financial sector organizations, as mentioned, UNEP-FI has a number of tools tailor-made for banks. For example, these two publications, the Impact Radar and the Portfolio Impact Analysis tool for banks can be found on UNEP-FI's TCFD program page, which we link to here. And the Portfolio Impact Analysis tool is a useful interactive output workflow based on UNEP-FI's unique holistic impact methodology. And some additional resources to flag today that can be helpful for banks and the financial sector more broadly. First, Oliver Wyman called for ambition to reality, focuses on actions required within corporate banking divisions and sets out 5 key priorities to make the commitments real. The second publication here by GFANS provides recommendations and guidance to deliver a global framework for ambitious and credible net zero transition plans for financial institutions across the financial sector. The third report by Unipify again provides guidelines for the banking sector, particularly for setting climate targets. And finally, the portfolio alignment team, which was formed by the UN Special Envoy for Climate and Finance, Mark Carney, to respond to growing investor and lender interests in measuring portfolios' relative alignment to the objectives of the Paris Agreement, provides here guidelines on measuring portfolio alignment to the 1.5-degree target. Great. And before we pause for any questions, I just wanted to remind you that to get your certificate today, you again need to fill in that feedback survey. So you will again be emailed the link. It's also going to be in the chat, but you can get it emailed to you as well. When you fill in that Google form, we'll then give you your certificate within about a week. Okay, so with that, I wanted to pause and see if we had any questions today before we close out our session.
Thank you, Stephanie. So my first question is that when we want to start the disclosure for climate-related financial disclosures, so TCFD has recommended that it is convenient or easier if you go with 3 phases. In the first phases, they recommended that governance and risk management would have been the best option to start with. And also today's sessions, we have seen that the other 2, that is the strategy and metrics and targets, if deemed material, then the disclosure is required. And TCFD's recommendation was that the implementation duration, standard duration could be 3 to 5 years. So what do you think that the initial different phases, what should be the optimum time for each phases? What do you think regarding the implementation?
That's a great question. Now, of course, that depends from each organization. But the first phase actually can tend to take the longest because it's really where you need to outline what are those risks and opportunities that are facing your organization and understand that materiality of it. However, the TCFD does really recommend just getting started. So in that first phase, it can often be a lot more qualitative than quantitative. And in that first phase, you'll probably have mini phases. So getting started, it's really identifying, okay, of those risks and opportunities that the TCFD highlighted that we discussed both yesterday and today, trying to understand more or less how are they going to impact your organization, understanding how they'll impact, you know, the majority of your portfolio, looking at the sectors that are most represented in your portfolio, and understanding kind of where the highest risks and opportunities will be financially. Then as you start to build on those and you start to do a scenario analysis, you'll start to understand the more exact numbers and really that quantitative analysis. But getting started off qualitatively is the first step. But I would expect that even just stepping into that first step is really kind of a year-long process to really understand how it impacts the whole organization.
Thank you.
No problem.
My second question.
Sure. Just a pause to see if Lopa has anything to add to that question.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Nothing to add. No, I'm just very interested in the questions, and I suppose the question is coming from the, with the view that if banks are to implement these recommendations, then what is the time frame that they would require, if I'm not wrong?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we'll take the next question then.
Okay, next question is that in case of measurement of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, our country perspective, the industries are not that much efficient right at this moment. So do you think that it will be wise to use the standard data based on the industry or few industries and their average data for the other industries will be okay initially for the industries?
Do you mean for scope 3 to be able to calculate scope 3?
Even for scope 2 too.
I mean, for scope 2, companies should be able to do that without any other information. So scope 1 and scope 2, a company can already conduct that with the information they have internally. When we reach scope 3, because that's looking more at your value chain, your supply chain, that's when it's required to make quite a few estimates or needing more information from the market. However, if you do use GHG protocol, that does give you kind of a good basis to be able to calculate these emissions, even if you don't have all the information that you think you might need through estimates. So I think starting with requirements in scope 1 and 2 is the most important, and that's also what the TCFD recommends, because obviously the more companies that are publishing their scope 1 and 2 disclosures makes it easier then for the scope 3 to be integrated, because we have more exact information from our supply chain, and expecting that scope 1 and 2 from all companies allows us to move towards scope 3. So in a staged approach, we often see requiring initially scope 1 and 2 and then moving into scope 3. But the GHG protocol does really help with scope 3. So larger companies should already be looking at their scope 3 using the GHG protocol guidance.
Thank you.
No problem. I think we have time for one more question if you do have one.
Any question from any other? Rehan? Shakot?
Any observation?
So on our part, there is no other questions, and I think we will go through the documents and other relevant articles referred by you, and later if we have any questions, we will mail you to have the answers. And thank you once again from Bangladesh Bank for the arrangement and also for you to provide us the time to enrich ourselves. Thank you, IFC. Thank you, Tiffany, and other resource persons. Thank you from Bangladesh Bank. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. And I'd like to pass to Lopa to close out the session today. Thanks, Lopa.
Thanks so much, Tiffany, for organizing this at, I would say relatively short notice. And I hope it was of use to Bangladesh Bank, and it was organized based on their request. So huge shout out to you, and also presenters, Drew, Vanina, and Zoo as well, for all the content and the materials. I think there will be questions, really, on specifics, especially I know that there were earlier questions raised on how to measure and also on the verifiers. So, for example, with scope 1 and 2, do we need verifiers, or is it something that, companies, as they put it out in their annual report, and that's accepted? So I think those are some specific questions that after we aggregate from Central Bank, we will reach out to you for further clarifications. And also if there's additional training requirement from their side, we'll reach out to you for that. And I think this is a very good first step. And the next step for us is to also open it up for other banks to participate in this training, because this one, we kept it very limited only for central bank staff who are relevant for this particular policy development. So again, thank you so much for your time and for your knowledge and sharing with us all of the new and updated highlights. Thanks again. Look forward to continuing with this conversation.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.